Hello and welcome, everyone. We're so excited to have our third installment of our co-published book with AAC&U and Rutledge. We are exploring equitable community campus relationships. I'm so excited to be able to welcome you all here today and to allow you to get started and have as much time as possible with Cindy, Vincent, and the crew that she brought with her today. So, Cindy, it's all yours.
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks everyone for joining us today. As Nicole said, I'm Cindy Vincent. I'm the Director of Strategic Portfolio Management and Communications at Boston University in Massachusetts. Today, we're going to be talking about our brand new edited volume, Exploring Equitable Community Campus Relationships, and particularly the second section, which I was the editor for. And this section focuses on equitable values and principles in community engagement. And so within this section, we have four different chapters. Authors from two of the chapters are with us today to talk about their projects and their collaborations in more depth. And we're very fortunate to have them today. The other ones who cannot be here today, the other chapters include Nurturing the VAW in Community Campus Partnerships with the Samoan Community in Oceanside, California by Grant, Teresa, and Madeline. Um, we have another chapter by Starr and Brooke, Literacy as a Weapon, Empowering Black Youth Through Equitable Community Engagement. And then our two chapters today that we'll be discussing, I will pass the microphone over to them. And our first one will be Ziwe Ki Nishao's son, Rachel Dolacek, Danielle Beckley, Kayla Neer, and Tammy West. And their chapter is called Building Equity Through Partnership, Developing a Rural Health Equity Resource Hub for Gender-Based Violence Survivors in Rural Western Kansas. And so again, our presenters today will be talking about how they centered equitable values within their community partnerships, their community campus partnerships, and what those values and principles are, and how sometimes there can be a lot of conversations or negotiations or compromises and that need to happen within these collaborations to ensure that everyone centers equity within their work and that is maintained throughout the lifespan of the collaboration. And so with that, I will pass the mic over to Z if you are here.
Hi, yes, we did send a request to share our screen because we did present some visuals accompany our presentation, if that's okay.
Have
Yep,
Nicole
you
and team.
should be good to go.
Okay. Can you hear, can you see my screen right now?
Yep,
Can you still see my screen sharing?
yep.
Okay, all right. Hi, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. My name is Ziwei Qi, or you can call me Z. I am from Fort Hays State University. I'm a faculty member from the Criminal Justice Program, and I'm also the co-founder and director for the Center for Empowering Victims of Gender-Based Violence. And our presentation today is really just the title of our book chapter, but I will let my colleague introduce herself as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Dolacek, and I am also a faculty member at Fort Hays State University in the College of Business, specifically the Applied Business Studies Department. And I am looking forward to sharing a bit more about our chapter.
Thank you. And then before we start with our introduction of the chapter, we do want to have a tagline that we believe that a community engaged project is grounded in listening, shared leadership, and a survivor-centered approach. So a little bit background about the project that we wrote for this chapter. It's a National Science Foundation founded research project, primarily focusing on underserved communities, focusing on and their lived experiences and how can we connect resources and services to serving them. So we got in the show planning grant under the NSF, and then this book chapter primarily focusing on what we come up together with community. I think one of the core themes for this project is how do we support survivors where resources are limited, distance matters, privacy is complicated, and the formal systems may not feel accessible. I don't know how many of our audience here from rural communities or working frequently with the rural communities. You might be familiar with a lot of the challenges that rural community facing, although we do want to recognize that not all rural community the same. But our research primarily focusing on rural Kansas, especially northwestern Kansas. There are a lot of the challenges specifically focusing on resource deficiency, and sometimes also this kind of lack of anonymity, where victims of gender-based violence feels very compelled to not to tell their stories, or they're afraid to be judged, afraid of stigma, and also afraid of probably other people not going to believe them. Some of the guiding principles in our research projects with community members is really that we are not coming in as a university to introduce a solution. Instead, we facilitated a lot of listening sessions with community members, really trying to understand what survivors, providers, and partners were already doing and imagining. In our project, we believe equitable engagement should begin with these questions. Who defines the problems? Who shapes the solution? Who benefits from the work? And how do we avoid adding burden for those already very pressured and entrenched community organizations?
So you'll hear us talk a little bit about BRIDGE, which stands for Building Rural Initiatives for Developing Gender-Based Violence Equity. And this really is an acronym that captures the heart of our Resource Hub's mission, which is connecting survivors with resources in their community. At the same time, we knew that we had to come up with some sort of acronym because it serves kind of a practical purpose, and it gives the initiative a name that's easy to remember. So you'll hear us talk about BRIDGE from the acronym standpoint. But to put the project into context here and what we did, not only did we have our group of partners from Fort Hays State University, but we also had a range of community partners, and that involved victim service agencies, healthcare providers, city and county leaders. We had our county attorneys present there, Chamber of Commerce, faith-based organizations, nurses, survivors were a big part of the discussion as well. So with that, the project included 6 listening sessions, and part of that, we also had 2 survivor-specific panels, more than 50 participants in this project. So we want to emphasize that our goal, even though, typically as an academic institution, our goal was not just to collect data. We wanted to make sure that we wanted to understand what communities were already experiencing, what they were needing, what they were doing. So certainly this was not a research project. It truly had a bigger purpose there. So with that, I'm going to keep this brief and let Z kind of move into what we've learned in our listening process.
So here we go, what we learned from our listening sessions. And some of these learnings had already been confirmed through our past collaborations and the conversations with the community members. But the challenge is primarily through 3 layers of barriers: geographical, social, and systemic. And I think audience can really go through all of these bullet points in terms of long distance, fragmented services, limited privacy. We do want to mention that a lot of times we tend to focusing this deficit perspective, like what we are lacking. However, what we're trying to really highlight in this book chapter is the rural strengths. What we learned from these listening sessions that because of these challenges, many community organizations and members, they're being very innovative, and they're trying to utilize already existing resources to connect their work with other agencies to maximize their services for local communities the best. I think that is a very important part. Give you an example for a lot of the local victim advocacy agencies, they actually utilize a lot of the kind of like mobile services, even with their own private vehicles. And then they will helping individuals who might need to get somewhere temporarily safe with their own connections. I know it may sound sometimes there's a lot of privacies or maybe sometimes potentially conflict of interest concerns, but in the rural communities where there's really a lacking of public transportation and to protect that anonymity, these type of level of relationship building is very, very important. So this is just one of many examples that we learned from rural organizations that they're really trying to leverage their already existing resources. And many executive director in the local communities, they're actually writing grants. They're going to educational program, but also they're going to schools to educating to promote a healthy relationship knowledges. I think this is also very important to tell that with such a shortage of staffing and the lack of funding, these organizations very much so trying to meet their full capacity to serving their local communities.
So kind of building off of that, what Zia said, um, this has to be practical. And so what we heard from those sessions, we wanted to focus on that. And I think this stands out, the quote that's on here, a resource is not truly accessible if it is 2 hours away, only online, only in English, and located in a place where confidentiality feels risky. So with that, breaking that down in terms of the needs here, some practical supports. That could be anything from mileage to childcare to accessible meeting times, language access, clear communication. Those were some of the things that came up in our sessions. Other things that we know in terms of needs here, trusted community spaces, especially maybe libraries, identifying that libraries could be a possible neutral point for information or referrals or connection. So that was identified in the sessions. And then just kind of moving on and moving forward with this, we know that access was not just about whether a service technically existed. It was about whether survivors could realistically and safely reach it.
One of the themes in our project, in addition to co-create solutions, co-create project with our community partners, another important theme is survivor-centered approach. I think a lot of times in research, we ask questions such as what happened, what danger are you in? I think it's important to also focusing this resilience-based idea when we working with survivors of gender-based violence. So a lot of times what we learn from this listening session is that instead of always asking, what do you need? What else can we provide? We also should frame our question like this. What support do you need to rebuild? What strengths are you already using? And what would make help more reachable here? So in a way, we are giving that agency to the survivors instead of making them to feel that there are a lot of times lack of control, to being able to allow them to be the experts in the process, ask them what could help them, what could give them a better support, build that resilience, recovery, and healing with them. I think that is a very important process that we've learned throughout the listening sessions, especially the two survivor panels. So we believe that the survivors are experts. They are not just data. They are not just our subject matters. They are the ones who actually giving us the idea how to create sustainable solutions. And then building resilience is very important in our approach.
And we also learned from this process that shared leadership and community partners, really important to look at how we're framing that. Our relationship as a university should not be just setting an agenda and asking community partners to give input. Instead, we need to work on balancing, and that can be balancing from a perspective of flexibility from the university team, Maybe it's adapting our timelines and being more realistic about partner capacity and knowing that our partners in this process have a full-time job and full responsibility. So how do we balance this for them? Um, we also want to mention transparency around our roles, expectations, timelines, and limits as part of the trust building process. So just something else to think about when you're working in that shared capacity.
I know what our time is very limited, so we wouldn't really dive into too further into the product we created throughout this project. So that's why we encourage you to read our book and chapters. So one of the outcome that we learned from this research project is we need to creating a health equity assessment tool for communities and service providers to better serve individuals experiencing gender-based violence. One of the challenges that we see is that some of the public health or screening tools that public hospitals or rural clinics has been using primarily focusing on symptoms, focusing on physical health, mental health, emotional health, perhaps, but not so much so when related to experience violence, especially generational violence and trauma. So a lot of times when we thinking about how can we better support survivors of gender-based violence, we need to ask the right question, understand the comprehensive needs that they're facing. So one of the products that we created is a health equity assessment tool. And in this specific tool, we incorporate additional measures focusing on how can we really address gender-based violence, not only from a criminal justice standpoint, but also a public health standpoint. But not only from a trauma-informed perspective, but also including resilience building framework to help survivors to build that long-lasting, sustainable supports and resiliency.
So our closing takeaways for you, one of the biggest lessons from our chapter is that equitable community campus partnerships are not built through good intentions alone. They require that structure, the flexibility, transparency, and a willingness to be changed by what we hear. So for us, this became less about bringing our university expertise and faculty expertise to the community and more about creating a space where different forms of expertise could shape the work together. So that expertise came from survivors with their lived expertise. It came from our advocate groups who brought the practice wisdom. It came from our community leaders who brought that local knowledge. And then, of course, what we had to share in terms of the university side of things, our tools, our institutional resources, things like that. And so equity was in how those forms of knowledge were kind of brought together. So we'll end with this and hand it back to Cindy. Just one idea could be equitable engagement starts when we stop treating community voice as feedback after the fact and begin treating it as leadership from the beginning.
I love that takeaway. Thank you, Z and Rachel. Definitely food for thought because as we consider like traditional service learning approaches or things like that, when we're shifting towards this equitable community engaged framework, we really are trying to have community voices be equitable leaders in the work that we're doing and decision makers in the work that we're doing. That shifts how we approach these things, right? So thank you guys so much for sharing your chapter. We'll open it up for questions at the end of today's session, but we'll move on to our second chapter. And so this chapter is entitled Equitable Community Engagement, a case study on blending social impact and social justice perspectives in service learning contexts. And today we have Leandra Hernandez and Sherry Almquist, and their third author is Stevie Muntz, who could not be here today. Leandra?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cindy. It's so wonderful to be here with you all today. Like Cindy mentioned, my name's Leandra Hernandez. My pronouns are she, her, ella. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Utah, and I'm so thrilled to be here with my community partner, Sherry. Would you like to introduce yourself, Sherry?
Yes, thank you, Leandra. My name is Sherry Almquist. I'm the Executive Director for Utah Tax Help Services, formerly Centro Hispano. This is the organization that we came from. Through this impact study, we found some changes that needed to be made, and we found it by creating our own nonprofit and making some pivotal adjustments and to be able to serve our community better.
Yeah, so thank you, Sherry. So, what we're going to do in our time today is we'll talk a little bit about some of the context of our chapter. We didn't prepare slides. Sherry and I are more conversational sorts of folks, but we'll talk a little bit about the project that Sherry and I developed together within the institutional support from Utah Valley University, where I used to teach with Dr. Stevie Munns. And then we'll also share a little bit about how our community partnership has traversed now two universities in Utah and multiple populations across two different counties. So, as you might remember from our title, Case Study on Blending Social Impact and Social Justice Perspectives, our project was rooted in a social justice lens, particularly because of its ability to help connect student service learning projects to vital opportunities for social change. And of course, as many of you are likely already familiar with, there are multiple ways to do service learning projects. There are multiple ways to do social justice projects, and they're not necessarily always the same or overlapping. But the reason that we utilize this framework in our connection and in our project specifically was because Stevie Munns and I were formally trained in these sorts of approaches at Utah Valley University. And we both used to work with the UVU Center for Social Impact, which was one of the most beautiful spaces on campus because it really helped connect faculty members and students to community partners. And the center also played a foundational role in helping not only bring everyone together, but in helping ensure that the projects thrived. So, in our time, this project actually started in 2022. And Sherry and I are so happy and thrilled to see that even 4 years later, we're able to share more about the project and also keep thinking about its future stages as well. So, to give you a little bit of the context here, like I mentioned earlier, Stevie and I both were in the Department of Communication at Utah Valley University, and we both worked with the Center for Social Impact on campus in different capacities. So I was the Associate Academic Director for Service Learning, where I trained faculty members in different service learning frameworks. And then Stevie was the Director of the Social Impact Metrics Lab. So together, she and I were connecting with community partners. We were mentoring faculty members and students. And in our time together there from 2021 to 2023, we mentored over 20 students in research capacities, taught several service learning courses, but we also connected hundreds of students to community partners like Sherry's and other organizations. And in the chapter, we talk a little bit about why we really privilege social justice and equity in these service learning contexts, particularly because these sorts of relationships are really developed on foundations of reflexivity, reciprocity, respect, and reflection. And because when done through a social justice lens, these sorts of approaches can provide structured opportunities, not just for students to engage with and reflect upon political, social, and economic contexts that their communities are dealing with, but because it also gives us an opportunity to directly prioritize the community partner from the very beginning. So in the Center for Social Impact, before I had even met Sherry or known of Centro Hispano, which is who we worked with back then, as Sherry noted, the organization has gone through some changes and she'll tell us a little bit more about that in a few minutes. The Center for Social Impact team and myself had worked for an entire semester with Sherry and her team to do sort of an intake sort of process where we worked together to research the organization, what it needed. We worked very closely with Sherry to kind of develop a portfolio, right, with a social impact lens and an equity design lens to say, okay, here's what we can do. What do you need? And how can we best approach this together to ensure not just that the community partner is prioritized at every step of the way, but to have these constant check-ins to ensure that we are on the same page in the intake pre-process. So that was fall of 2022. And then in spring of 2023, that's when we launched the project in my intercultural communication class. And I was and still am a critical scholar, as is Stevie. So we used critical social justice lenses, not just to create our intercultural communication courses, but also in the mentorship of our students to help them as they were working with Centro Hispano. And Sherry and I were actually talking about this yesterday when thinking about difficult dialogues, anti-DEI laws, and how we do equity-based work in counties or cities or states where maybe there's a little bit of hesitation at the very least or outright restriction at the very most. And those of you who teach culture-based classes, gender-based violence classes, you know that it can be very challenging to talk about these topics. But what we do in our classes is start right out the bat with questions about identity, bias, reflexivity, positionality, and everything else. And then we structured the class to have 6 check-ins along the way so that when students were doing their work with community partners and with Sherry's team, we were able to have these very honest and open conversations about perceptions and beliefs that students had about themselves as they were working with the community. And in terms of the actual structure, Sherry visited our class at least 2 to 3 times that semester as well to introduce herself, to talk about the organization and its needs. Students were interfacing with Sherry and with me. And then once we launched the project, which was really to help figure out what Centro Hispanos and the low income tax clinics members needed from a cultural perspective, how they were experiencing their life in Utah County and Utah. Then they started doing interviews and phone surveys, some bilingually. And then Stevie and I were working with our research assistants and myself to translate some of the interviews that were bilingual to then get the data back to Sherry. So it wasn't just an intercultural communication class where we're talking about and doing and living cultural competence. The students were also learning how to do qualitative research, how to do interviews, how to do bilingual interviews, and then interfacing with Sherry, sometimes with me, sometimes separately, to share data with her and so on and so forth. So if you're sitting there thinking, Leah, this is way too much for one semester, you might be right, but it worked so well the first semester that we did it again the next fall when I got to the University of Utah with a different student population and one of our northern counties instead of one of our southern counties. So ultimately in the chapter, we talk a little bit about the need to create such projects, as our previous presenters have already shared, for and with and by communities, not just simply us coming into a community and imposing ourselves, but privileging and prioritizing our relationships with the community partners from the very beginning. And then also acknowledging, as our previous presenters have also shared, the absolute necessity, significance, and importance of working within our structures and our multiple teams to help ensure that the project is as strong as it can be. So in the chapter, what we did is we talk a little bit about the project, but we also did a plática or a conversation of sorts where Stevie, Sherry, and I reflected upon the project and what equity means within this specific context. So in our plática or in our conversation, we asked ourselves 4 guiding questions, right? How do we define equity now, like in the beginning, but also retroactively? What are our thoughts on social impact? How can universities and communities work together most effectively to achieve equitable outcomes? And what does this mean and how do we do it in an anti-DEI context? And I'll only share just a few points about equity because I know that's really the heart of today's conversation. But in our conversations, we really chatted about how equity centers fairness and justice for all students and all community members. And really to understand that, and Sherry noted this very importantly, that equity in partnerships between community members and universities means recognizing the systemic disparities that exist, but having an intentional focus on reciprocity, that is really critical to ensure that the benefits and opportunities are flowing both ways, not just once, but consistently throughout the entire project. And Sherry and I and the class had multiple check-ins throughout the semester, like I mentioned. And then Stevie and Sherry and the research assistants would join us at the very end, kind of for like our data unveiling, our white paper session, our brief session, where Sherry and the students had the opportunity to interface directly to chat about what the students found, what Sherry's team's thoughts were, and how they wanted to move forward. And we were really thinking about equity as a framework that centers intentionality, reflexivity, community leveraging of resources, collective responsibility for each other, which is really critical from the relational angle, and breaking down barriers to lead to tangible and measurable outcomes, not just for the students, but of course, importantly, for the community members as well. And when we're thinking about moving forward, given that this has been a 4-year project that's still in the works, I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic to Sherry so that she can share some updates with you all, not just about the organization, but about the ways in which Sherry's team implemented some of the feedback from our students.
Thank you. Thank you. What a great lead in. This impact study changed me as a practitioner in the way that I view our community members. The first thing I learned was trust is a big factor, and it starts with listening, not prescribing. I led the organization, through our clinic, through a financial literacy lens. They're low income taxpayers. So what's the commonality? We were already translating everything. We had multiple offices, but what really do these taxpayers have in common? And to me, it was financial literacy. They need to know how to do their finances better. But in discussing like the pivotal change for us for me was understanding that 80% of our population were new Americans, and they are looking for opportunity. It's about being economically mobile, being able to adapt and be healthy economically, empowered economically. So as we discussed the outcomes with the organization that I was with, it became clear that I was the one experiencing the changes, me and our staff within the LITC, and that we were not going to be able to complete the changes that we needed to at that organization. Well, they would be better changed outside of that organization. Understanding that trust is a huge thing, and the organization had that trust in the community. So it meant that we needed to build on the networks and that we had. And we opened up a new organization January of 2025, January 1st, and are at the UVU Business Resource Center, where we had built up a great relationship with UVU through this impact study. And we have access now to be able to address the mobility the financial mobility that they were looking for. We started an entrepreneurship program, a small business that we're teaching in English and Spanish, providing it through Zoom and to all of our locations. Foreign skilled labor credentialing program, where we noticed that, instead of just looking at it through putting band-aids on through financial literacy, it's like what they really need. There's so many that were coming in through our clinic and our low-income taxpayer clinic that were doctors and had all of this potential in their home countries. Well, why don't we look at getting those certifications and working, building up your mobility economically here by doing that and looking at career development and again the small business classes that we started teaching. Equitable engagement we needed to be changed by the community rather than expecting the community to adapt to what we were prescribing, I guess is this kind of the ball of what I was figuring out, rather than expecting the community to adapt to us. We had to change, and we did quite a bit.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that, Sherry, because I remember we would have conversations with students as well where they would say, oh, well, we have these thoughts about how this could work better, or so on and so forth. And we would always send them back to the data. What are your community members telling you? You know, you're doing interviews, you're doing phone interviews, you're meeting up with individuals at coffee shops. Like, it's easy for us as scholars or the ones taking the class to be able to have the prescriptive ideas of how it should work, but also going back to the point of community relationships and equity, it was always, what does the community need and what are they telling you? And that was a really transformative um, takeaway, not just for the students, but like Sherry noted, for Sherry and the organization as well. And there was one point from the chapter that I wanted to bring up as we close, where Sherry brought this up as a really formative moment for her that we decided to include in the chapter. When one of the students in the class said to Sherry directly in our final class meeting, your clients see themselves as entrepreneurs. They're immigrating to America looking for their dreams, but the financial literacy classes that Centro Hispano's clinic is offering, they're missing the mark because they view financial literacy as something people with money need, but they're all working for cash, trying to start their businesses. They're trying to find their own American dream, and they want and need direction in that way. And, in closing in the chapter, we talk a little bit about what transparency and trust and reciprocity mean for equity and how they are absolute non-negotiables when it comes to developing equitable relationships, not just between universities and community partners, but also for community members as well. And then we also share in the chapter some thoughts about how one does this work in an anti-DEI context by still doing the work and trucking along also, but by thinking about maybe reframing the topics a little differently, or perhaps using different words in a strategically ambiguous manner to get the work done while maybe not bringing the spotlights on. So yeah, we'll go ahead and stop there, but thank you for your time. We're really happy to be here with you all.
Thank you so much, Leandra and Sherry. And that's a great point to bring up, which is that in today's political controversial context, some of you guys might be out in states where you can't openly talk about DEI or you can't openly talk about your equity work. But I can guarantee across the board, we're all still doing it, right? We're all doing it in some way, shape, or form because it's important work that continues to need to be done. So I appreciate that you bring that up, Leandra. I'm going to pivot now to a moderated Q&A. So give me 1 second while I spotlight our authors again. So you can see them when I ask them questions. Okay. And when I'm done with the moderated Q&A, please feel free to put some questions in the chat that you have for our authors today, and I'll open it up for open Q&A. Okay, my first question for you guys is that equitable partnerships are often messy and require ongoing learning. What challenges, mistakes, or tensions emerged during implementation, and how did you navigate them?
We can start here. I think one of the challenges we want to mention here in this group is the timeline, because once again, that project was grant funded. We have a very strict timeline. We need to use the money at this point. So a lot of times you have to meet that deadline from faculty perspective. However, I'm sure everybody here working with community engaged, as community engaged scholar and practitioner, know that it's not everything always as planned. A lot of times things might change, especially I think we experience a lot of times organization have turnover, and then there are some other priorities that community member have to do, because especially our partnership is mainly focusing on providing services for victims and survivors. And if there's emergency, they have to prioritize that. They have no time to sit down with us, talk about what we can do in 6 months or a year. So we have to really be mindful about that. So being able to have that weekly check-in via email, quick chat, quick call, and even going to meet them in their office. And then that is very important. And I feel like to practice patience is very important. And then the patience is not just from my point of view as a scholar trying to get things done. I think that is very important, but also it's from the idea that you are doing this work with your community members. You're not doing it for the sake of get it done, get something published. And then you have to really work on that. And also another thing I want to mention about is IRB, because we are doing a lot of the work with survivors and that have to go through IRB. And it's such a kind of quite an experience to go through IRB to allowing us to interview survivors. But I think that is very, very important too. We want to make sure they're safe, they're being heard. So I think that is also another part when we're thinking about working with community members and protecting the subjects, protecting the community to actually truly co-create that equitable engagement.
I really appreciate that you said that because timeline was critical for us too. And like I mentioned earlier, there were so many moving parts in our project from the intake process the semester beforehand to training students on multiple components to ensuring that the center's team, Sherry's team, Stevie's RAs, and then the students were all looped in at the same time. So we had to get incredibly creative when it came to creating and managing those communication structures for all the stakeholders on top of reminding students we're not just doing this for a course project for fun. Like there are very real tangible outcomes on the line here with accountability and then also being able to have open and honest conversations with students and Sherry when students' lives were falling apart and we say maybe we need to move the dial slightly down. If we had goals for every student group to do 5 interviews per semester, maybe we're going to shoot for 3, right? So also trying to be mindful of how to manage it in the moment with everyone's timeline, abilities, bandwidth, and then also acknowledging the very real realities of the research process. As we know, when we would have so many interviews and calls lined up, but then individuals couldn't meet for whatever reason, and then we're pivoting. So yeah, having the support was critical, but also being very honest in the moment about timeline was critical too. And then reminding students like we need to tell Sherry everything in the moment as we're going, right? So it was almost kind of like job training 101 at the same time we were doing research and community engagement and everything else.
Great, thanks. I'm going to move on to our next question, and Sherry and Rachel, you can chime in on this one. What has been most meaningful or transformative for you, your team, or your community partners as a result of this, as a result of this collaboration and the values and principles that you're centering within this work? And Sherry, I know you already sort of touched upon this, so maybe you want to expand upon that a little bit more.
I I really feel like for me and our group, it was recognizing the community members as partners, putting them at the head of the table, letting them participate instead of, like I said before, prescribing what I thought needed to be done.
And I feel like for us, it was similar because our project shifted from being a research idea into a shared community conversation. And there again, that value that our community partners bring. And then, of course, the very powerful stories that we heard from our survivor panel in terms of what they needed. And I think it was important to hear, important for them to hear us in terms of being believed and understood and treated as a whole person. So that was really meaningful and transformative in our project.
Thank you. Leandra and Z, did you want to chime in on this question?
I feel like it's another just quickly meet at where they at, and also don't come in assuming you know it all. I think we mentioned about treat them everybody as experts, and then we never call ourselves like professors or doctors. You're coming in as one of the community members. You're not assuming that, oh, this is what study shows. Instead, because the lived experience is very unique and our project is trying to really solving this local problem. So to coming in as somebody eager to learn is very important to me. And I feel like with that mindset, I feel very connected with the survivors. And then we laughed, we cried together. I know maybe I shouldn't be too embedded in that setting, but I feel like by doing that, allowing them to open up a little bit more, telling their stories, and feel like they actually trusted us and want to create these solutions with us together.
Yeah, I agree. It was so meaningful to have conversations with students and research assistants about what migration, acculturation, assimilation, and financial literacy or literacy writ large means for communities in Utah, particularly because, Utah as a state has a very strong ethos committed to supporting refugees and migrants. But I think sometimes where it falls short is that different stakeholders or grant funders might not really know what the migration or refugee process looks like for different diasporic communities coming from different areas, right? And I think several of our students had similar beliefs themselves, many of whom had gone on missionary trips to countries where some of the individuals they were interviewing or talking to were from, right? So it was very easy for them to develop linguistic cultural connections on that front. But going back to many of the same points we've already talked about, it was so important to always remember that everyone is the expert of their own story and their own experience, and that we need to treat those stories not only with care and sensitivity and trust and respect, but also remember that the ideas we might have about the cultural experience might not always be accurate or the best, right? So, really upholding the needs and the perspectives of the community members and the community partners was just as important, if not even more important, than also kind of honoring our own perspectives and lived experiences too. And it sounds so obvious, right? But when you're in the moment and you're doing the work with students and community members, you keep on having those aha moments, and you're like, this is why we're doing this, right?
Yeah, and that's such a great point to bring up, which is some of the things sometimes when I'm talking about equitable community engagement and I add labels or words to it, it's like, yeah, this seems really obvious, but when you're doing it, it's not always that obvious. Or when you're confronted with tensions in the moment, that can be very difficult to sort of navigate in real time. So I appreciate you bringing that up. At this point in time, I'd love to open up questions to the audience. So if anyone has a question for our authors, feel free to just unmute and ask a question or throw it in the chat and I'll ask the question for you. And if you guys need a few more minutes to think about a question, I have one more moderated question I can ask. Okay, my last question for you guys is for researchers, practitioners, students, or community organizations seeking to build more equitable community campus relationships, what advice would you offer based on your experience?
Uh, in addition to listening before assuming or designing, recognizing power and structure, I think it's also important to um, recognize it's important to compensate your community partners, pay them to do this. Don't assume that they're doing this for free. It's very important. I feel like I know it sounds like it's very kind of a way of thinking transactional, but it's very important. Their time matters. And when they're sitting in this space with you, telling you their expertise, they're sharing their knowledge, they're being a consultant. We are trying to seek every possibility to compensate them, even beyond market value, to actually acknowledge their value to our project and their time.
And that compensation might be in addition to like a stipend, like mileage, childcare. Um, could even think about meeting times and things like that. So agree with that completely.
Something that I always like to tell folks when they ask, how do I get started? Where do I get started? I always remind them, again, it might seem very obvious, but like, what about your lived experience raises certain questions for you, like burning questions, burning rages or angers or things that really galvanize you to move? And that usually kind of helps get the dial turning in terms of things that are passionate, that they could be passionate about in ways that they could give back to their community, right? So one of the reasons I really wanted to work with Centro Hispano and the low income tax clinic specifically is because as a Latina myself who has dealt with her own sense of financial e/literacy moments rooted in like cultural context, migration context, things of that nature. I could already immediately tell that I was passionate about this topic for personal reasons and academic reasons, which is also an easy way if you're an educator to sort of build those connections for and with your students as well. And Sherry and I have talked about this, but Utah specifically has a very strong connection to service learning and community engagement and giving back to the community, particularly in cultural context. So I knew that my own individual connection to the topic and the organization, coupled with the students, would help them achieve like a stronger, for lack of a better term, buy-in to the topic, right? Than if I would have said something about like, we're working with this one organization, but I can't really justify why to you. It's just someone I got partnered with. You know what I mean? So even when working with graduate students and like emerging scholars, when they're thinking about trying to figure out how to launch a project like this is always one of the questions that I start with. Like, what are you passionate about? How do you want to give back to your community? And then how can we help connect you to community partners in that space?
And Cherry, do you want to add anything?
I would agree with Leandra on the burning passion. We get a lot of volunteers that come and want to serve, and we have various places we can put them depending on they're going to be the happiest where they have that burning passion, whether it's a little piece of the small business class, one of the modules that they just feel really there's one module that I have to teach. I am so burning passionate about this one particular module that I could build an entire probably organization out of that particular topic alone. But yeah, just finding that passion and looking for a placement that and where it fits, where it makes sense.
Awesome. Thank you. So we have just a couple minutes left. Do any of the authors have any last parting words or comments or takeaways you'd like to point out to everyone?
Can I say one thing? The environment is so dynamic. So holding on to these values is so important to uh, just to keep yourself guided in the right direction. The environment is crazy right now, and really just centering in and remembering to put your community and listen to their voices. That's why we're here. And being willing to be changed by your community and accept that that is where the power is, that is where your work comes from.
Z, did you want to say something or no?
Uh, yes, quickly. I just think, I feel like this is a research project always passionate about. I was interested in gender-based violence in rural communities. And then I want to make a disclaimer, this grant is also being canceled ultimately. And then we didn't get our stage 2 grant either. So it's a very big, huge disappointment to me. And then I came back to my community partners and telling them about this. And then to my surprise, they're actually trying to comfort me. They say, it's okay, Z. There are always other opportunities. And then we can work together. Things changed, like what Sherry said, this very dynamic environment. Just because of this thing's canceled doesn't mean your work is not important. So to be fair, I came in to think about, okay, let's do a solution, find a solution for survivors gender-based violence. But to a certain extent, I feel like I built a community with me and to co-create that solidarity. And I don't feel like as that defeated. And I think that is very important to me, learn from this experience.
Great. Thank you. Okay, we have just about a minute left. I'd like to share, oh, maybe not. I was going to share my screen, but instead I will just I will just verbally tell you. So thank you again for joining our session today. If you can, Nicole has put the link in the chat to go ahead and pick up your copy of Exploring Equitable Community Relationships, published by Rutledge, AAC&U, and Campus Compact. And I wanted to just point out real quick, our next webinar will be in 2 weeks on Tuesday, July 14th at 2 p.m. Eastern. And this will be focusing on centering equity through authentic relationships and co-design approaches. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. We greatly appreciate that. Bye.